one that had been there all along but had never needed to assert itself so strongly. I began to notice how often, throughout my marriage and especially during the years of raising children, I had deferred without resentment, trusting that shared decision-making meant someone else could carry the weight when I grew tired. And while that trust had been well placed for decades, it had also left me unpracticed in certain forms of vigilance, unaccustomed to questioning details that seemed settled. And as I reviewed old documents, bank statements, and household records with new eyes, I felt a mixture of regret and acceptance. Because while I could acknowledge what I might have done differently, I also recognized that trust itself was not a flaw, only the absence of safeguards had been. This distinction mattered to me, because it allowed me to preserve tenderness in my memories, rather than letting hindsight harden them into blame. Michael's repayment plan progressed slowly but steadily, and with each payment, the sense of crisis diminished, though it never disappeared entirely, lingering as a reminder of how quickly stability can be threatened by choices made in the name of love or urgency. Our conversations became more deliberate, less casual. And while there were moments when I missed the ease we once shared, I also appreciated the honesty that had replaced it, because ease without transparency is fragile. And I had learned, perhaps later than some but not too late, that durability requires truth, even when truth is uncomfortable. There were times I wanted to reach out and smooth things over, to reassure him beyond what was necessary, but I resisted that impulse, understanding that growth often requires space, and that closeness rebuilt on clearer terms could be stronger than what existed before. Friends and neighbors, sensing a change in me they could not quite name, offered help in ways both welcome and overwhelming. And while I appreciated their concern, I found myself selective in what I accepted, choosing support that respected my autonomy rather than undermined it, because I was learning, in subtle but important ways, how to inhabit widowhood without surrendering agency. I joined a small community group, not because I felt lonely in the traditional sense, but because I wanted connection on my own terms, conversations that were not defined by loss but by shared presence, and in those interactions, I discovered that my story, when shared carefully, resonated with others in ways I had not anticipated, offering comfort not through advice but through recognition. There were moments, usually late at night when the house settled into its deepest quiet, that doubts resurfaced. Questions that circled without clear answers. Had Thomas felt burdened by the decision to protect me in this way? Had he struggled with the conflict between trusting his son and safeguarding his wife? Had he worried that his actions might cause tension after his death, fanned while I would never know his private thoughts? I found solace in remembering his character, the way he approached problems with patience and foresight, rarely acting impulsively, always considering consequences beyond the immediate. And in that remembrance, I chose to believe that his final months had not been filled with regret, but with resolve, a quiet determination to leave things as stable as possible for those he loved. As the seasons changed, marking time more reliably than my emotions ever could, I took small steps toward redefining my life, reorganizing spaces in the house, not to erase Thomas, but to accommodate the person I was becoming, someone who valued simplicity and clarity perhaps more than before, someone less willing to assume that love alone could solve practical problems. I updated my own documents, reviewed accounts, asked questions I might once have deferred, and with each action, I felt a subtle strengthening, a reassurance that while vulnerability is an unavoidable part of aging, helplessness is not, and that preparation, far from being pessimistic, is an expression of care for oneself and for others. The boundary between Michael and me remained, sometimes visible, sometimes barely perceptible, but always present, and while it changed the texture of our relationship, it also preserved it, preventing resentment from taking root where misunderstanding once threatened. And in that sense, the boundary became a form of respect, a mutual acknowledgement that love does not grant unlimited access to another's resources, emotional or otherwise. I saw him mature in ways I had long hoped for, not through success alone, but through accountability. And while our bond would never return to its previous shape, it evolved into something more honest, less idealized, and perhaps more resilient. In quieter reflections, I found myself returning to the concept of protection, not as a shield against all harm, but as a framework for navigating it. And I realized that Thomas's greatest act of care had not been to prevent every possible difficulty, but to ensure that when difficulty arose, I would not face it without options, without agency, without dignity. That understanding allowed me to release lingering anger, not by denying it, but by placing it within a broader context of intention and foresight. And in doing so, I felt a sense of closure begin to form. Not an ending, but a settling. A readiness to carry forward the lessons learned without being defined by the pain that taught them. As I moved through my days, tending to small routines and larger decisions alike, I came to see that the house, once threatened, had become a symbol not only of memory, but of continuity, a place where past, present, and future intersected in ways both ordinary and profound. And in that realization, I felt gratitude not just for the protection I had been given, but for the wisdom gained through experience, a wisdom that would guide me in the years ahead, shaping choices made with care rather than assumption, with openness rather than fear. As another year edged closer, marked less by dates on a calendar than by subtle internal shifts, I began to understand that what had happened was not a single crisis with a clear beginning and end, but a reorientation of how I understood responsibility, trust, and the quiet negotiations that shape family life over decades. And this understanding did not arrive all at once, but in fragments, often triggered by ordinary moments: a bill arriving in the mail, a conversation overheard at the grocery store, a casual remark from a friend about helping an adult child, that carried new weight. Now that I had lived through the consequences of unexamined generosity, I found myself listening differently, noticing how often love is framed as sacrifice without limit, and how rarely we speak of the necessity of consent in those sacrifices, especially when they are made on behalf of others. Michael continued to meet his obligations, and while our interactions remained polite and increasingly respectful, there was an undercurrent of something unspoken between us, a shared awareness of how close we had come to losing more than money. And sometimes, in quieter conversations, he would acknowledge this directly, expressing regret not only for the risk he had taken, but for the assumption that my consent could be bypassed in the name of protecting me from worry. Those moments were difficult, but important, because they marked a shift from defensiveness to reflection, from explanation to understanding. And while they did not erase the past, they allowed us to move forward without the burden of unresolved resentment, which can be as damaging to relationships as betrayal itself. In my own life, I noticed a growing clarity about what I was willing to tolerate and what I was not, a clarity that extended beyond finances into emotional and social realms, influencing how I spent my time and energy. And while this newfound discernment sometimes surprised those around me, it felt less like a change in personality and more like a return to something essential. A recognition that boundaries are not walls but frameworks that allow connection to occur without harm. I declined invitations that drained me, accepted help without guilt when it was offered respectfully, and learned to articulate my needs with a directness that would have once felt uncomfortable. And in doing so, I discovered that many people responded not with resistance but with relief, as though they, too, were grateful for clarity. There were moments of loneliness, certainly, because independence does not eliminate the desire for companionship. And while I had friends and family, the specific intimacy of marriage, the shared history, the shorthand language, the unspoken understanding was irreplaceable. And I allowed myself to grieve that loss without rushing to fill the space it left, understanding that grief, like trust, requires time to reshape itself into something livable. I found comfort in small rituals, morning walks that followed no particular route, evenings spent reading or listening to music Thomas loved, not as a way of clinging to the past but as a means of honoring it, of acknowledging that love continues to influence us long after its physical presence is gone. As the anniversary of Thomas's death approached, I felt a mixture of apprehension and calm, unsure which emotion would dominate, and on that day, instead of isolating myself as I had during earlier milestones, I chose to visit a place we had loved. A quiet park where we had often walked together in our later years. And there, surrounded by familiar scenery, I reflected on the many ways his influence remained woven into my life. Not only through memory but through the structures he had put in place, the careful planning that had allowed me to navigate crisis without being overwhelmed by it. In that reflection, gratitude emerged not as a denial of pain, but as its companion. A recognition that love, when expressed thoughtfully, can continue to protect even in absence. The experience also changed how I viewed aging, shifting my focus from decline to adaptation, from fear to preparation. And I began to speak more openly with peers about topics often avoided: estate planning, financial transparency, the importance of shared knowledge within partnerships, not as warnings, but as conversations grounded in lived experience. And to my surprise, these discussions were often met with interest rather than discomfort, suggesting that many people carried similar concerns but lacked the language or impetus to address them. In sharing my story selectively, I found that vulnerability, when paired with reflection, could serve not only as catharsis, but as a quiet form of advocacy, encouraging others to examine their own assumptions before crisis forced the issue. Michael and I marked a tentative new normal, one defined less by expectation and more by mutual respect. And while our relationship would always carry the imprint of what had happened, it was no longer dominated by it, allowing space for genuine connection to re-emerge in smaller, more deliberate ways. I learned to appreciate these moments without longing for what had been, understanding that relationships, like people, evolve through rupture as well as continuity, and that acceptance does not require forgetting, only integrating experience into a broader understanding of love and responsibility. In the quiet of the house, now familiar again in its stillness, I recognized that the sense of safety I felt was not merely the absence of threat but the presence of preparedness, a state of mind cultivated through awareness rather than assumption. And this awareness extended beyond my personal circumstances, shaping how I perceived the world, how I listened to stories of others, how I evaluated risk and trust in all its forms. I had learned, through painful but instructive experience, that wisdom is not the opposite of love but its refinement, a distillation of care informed by reality rather than idealism. As I looked ahead, not with certainty but with steadiness, I felt a quiet confidence that whatever challenges remained would be met with the same combination of openness and discernment that had carried me through the past year. And in that confidence, I sensed Thomas's presence, not as a shadow but as a foundation, something solid beneath my feet, supporting each step even as I walked alone. And it was in that space, between memory and possibility, that I found a sense of peace I had not expected, a peace rooted not in what had been lost, but in what had been preserved through foresight, integrity, and love expressed with wisdom. In the months and years that followed, life settled into a rhythm both predictable and new, shaped by lessons learned and boundaries established. And as I moved through days marked by small accomplishments and quiet victories, I began to notice how much strength had been cultivated through struggle. The way resilience grows, not in comfort, but in the careful navigation of challenge. And I understood that the crisis with the second mortgage, while frightening and unfair, had served as an unexpected teacher, reminding me of the importance of vigilance, preparation, and self-advocacy, lessons that could not have been imparted without experience. I rearranged the house gradually, shifting furniture not only for convenience but to mark new chapters, keeping Thomas's favorite chair by the window where morning light fell gently upon it. A symbol of memory preserved without allowing nostalgia to dominate. And in these small adjustments, I found both solace and empowerment. A tangible reminder that I could shape my environment and my life with intention rather than simply responding to circumstance. Conversations with Michael became steadier and more sincere, less dominated by oversight and defensiveness, and more by honesty and accountability. And while we did not recapture the effortless closeness of the past, we discovered a depth of understanding that had previously been absent. A recognition that trust is earned through action, and that love does not exempt anyone from responsibility, even those we hold most dear. I became more attuned to my own needs, both practical and emotional, learning to balance generosity with discernment, compassion with firmness, and in doing so, I found that love could coexist with a revelation I had not fully grasped when Thomas was alive, for his presence had allowed me to rely on him in ways that now required independent management. I invested time in friendships and community, attending gatherings not out of obligation but with a deliberate choice to participate, sharing my experience in measured ways that offered guidance without preaching. And I realized that vulnerability, when framed with reflection, could be a source of empowerment, both for myself and for those who listened. Holidays and anniversaries carried new meaning, sometimes bittersweet. Yet in their poignancy, I found gratitude for the life I had shared with Thomas, the children we raised, the home we built, and the awareness that love, when combined with foresight, leaves gifts that endure far beyond physical presence. Financial diligence became part of my daily practice, not as obsession but as stewardship. Reviewing statements, understanding obligations, and planning contingencies with a calm diligence that contrasted sharply with the fear that had gripped me when the second mortgage was first discovered. And in that diligence, I felt agency restored, a knowledge that I could face the unknown without being unprepared. Occasionally, I would reflect on the word temporary, the same word Michael had used when justifying his actions, and I recognized that life rarely offers truly temporary solutions. What is temporary in intention can become permanent in consequence. An awareness of this fact allows one to act with greater care, to question assumptions, to insist upon transparency and consent. Lessons I now carried not only for my own protection but to impart to others in need of guidance. My grief softened over time, its sharp edges delving into a steady presence that reminded me of both love and loss. And alongside it grew a deeper understanding of human complexity, the ways people can act out of hope, fear, or misguided protection, and the ways those actions ripple through lives in unforeseen ways. I became conscious of the gift Thomas had left me, not merely the house, not merely the legal protections, but the foresight and intentionality that allowed me to endure, to respond wisely, and to preserve dignity in the face of adversity. That gift taught me that love is most enduring when it combines care with prudence, emotion with action, and trust with safeguard. In time, I found a balance between memory and presence, between reflection and engagement, recognizing that the quiet of the house could now serve as a space for meditation and renewal rather than a reminder of absence, and that the protection afforded by Thomas's final acts extended beyond the physical structure of our home into the architecture of my own life, enabling me to navigate relationships, finances, and personal growth with an intentionality I had not fully exercised before. Ultimately, I learned that the greatest gift we can leave and receive is not always tangible. It can be the security of knowledge, the assurance that decisions are safeguarded, and the clarity to move forward with both courage and wisdom. And in this understanding, I found peace. A sense of completion, not because life had become simple or pain had disappeared, but because I had been entrusted with the tools to live fully, love responsibly, and protect myself even as I continued to give love to those around me. A legacy of foresight and care that endured in the quiet house where memory, trust, and resilience now coexist, shaping every step I take into the years ahead.